So first of all, thank you for inviting me and bringing me here. It's truly a pleasure and to be in such a nice conference with so many interesting people. So today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about a few different projects I have on using geolocated datasets and geolocated data to study human behavior and basically observe how people are behaving in different times and places. Right? So you've probably seen something like this before. So this is what happens on the internet. You have a lot of data being generated. You have people posting tweets, updating Facebook, liking things, uploading videos, etc. And people are starting to get a little bit concerned that that the internet and the amount of data that's being accumulated on the internet somehow is bringing us to what I call the stink threshold. Right? And the stink threshold is everything you do, the internet knows about. So every breath you take, every move you make, every bond you break, etc. But this is also generating a lot of opportunity and creating many, many possibilities for the study of behavior, and also many challenges on how can you actually process this data and analyze this data, right? So this is, of course, gathering the interest not only of science, but also in nature, in economics, computer science, etc. So it's creating all of these challenges and all these opportunities. And the reason, of course, and why we're witnessing most of this happening and all of these opportunities arising in the last 4 or 5 years is, of course, the rise of social media, right? So the rise of this seemingly infinite number of tools and systems online that allow us to somehow interact with each other and share our knowledge or our interests, our behaviors, etc. Where we are, what we're eating, what you're listening to, etc. And you'll probably recognize some of those. Some of them have disappeared already. Many others have been added in the meantime, etc. So, in all of this, of course, we have to use the tools of network science and looking not only what the dots, so usually I consider each little dot to be a person, and the little links, also how they are being created and destroyed, but also how things are happening on top of this network and how these link creation and destruction is impacting the evolution of the network, right? So you not only have people and interactions between people, so friendship links on Facebook, if you like, but you also have things happening on top of these links, right? So you have actually people communicating through these things, liking each other and posting things on each other's wall, etc. Right? And somehow these two things should be connected to each other, and they also should be somehow interdependent, right? But you also have to be careful and analyze not only the interactions that's happening, but also being able to distinguish between the different types of interactions, right? Because different types of interactions can have very different semantic meanings. So here I'm showing you an example for Twitter. On both sides of the screen, you have one figure. On both sides, to each dot on this side corresponds one dot on that side. So each user on this side corresponds to one user on that side. But here I'm switching the links, right? So on this side, what I have is I'm connecting users whenever they retweet each other. While on this side, I'm connecting users whenever they mention each other, so whenever they talk to each other or about each other somehow. And then I'm just throwing it in a graph clustering algorithm and letting it do its thing. Right here, you immediately and clearly see two clusters. Right? You see the blue guys, you can see the red guys. And these are very extremely well-defined clusters that are defined by retweets. And here, what you see no clustering structure. I mean, you can force the algorithm to give you two clusters, and it'll give you a little blue appendage over there. But that doesn't actually mean anything, right? It's clear that there is no modular structure. And what this is telling you is that retweets, on one hand, have the semantic meaning of agreement, right? If I retweet someone, it means I am agreeing with that person. Well, mentions just means you are talking to someone or about someone and does not have this meaning. So you have to be careful also about this a little bit. So far, and this is just a little bit of an introduction, I've mentioned that, okay, so you have these declared friendships or these follow relationships. You can have several types of interactions happening on top of these things. But of course, the reason why I'm here today and why you guys are listening to me is not only that these two things are actually connected to each other, right? So what happens on top of the network impacts the network itself. So if I start commenting on the posts of a friend on Facebook and I see somebody else commenting as well, there's a higher probability that I'll connect to this person, right? So the two layers interact with each other. But also that all of these things are embedded in geography, right? So you have to take also space into account. So the fact that I live in Marseille means that I will meet people in Marseille, right? So I'm more likely to be friends of people in Marseille. So if you look on my Facebook activities, it'll probably be more likely that I will interact with people from Marseille. So it's not completely general, and it's not in a completely arbitrary space, but it's actually embedded in a real space. Right? And I believe that this is one of the most important things that so far has been more or less neglected, or at least not given as much attention as it could have been. So people, of course, have been playing with these things. So this is from a social networks paper. This is, of course, not mine, where people basically looked at Twitter and declared the location field and just tried to geolocate the location fields and then try to measure these things. And you clearly see this dependence, right? You know, so people tend to be more friends or have friends that are closer to them than friends that are far away. Of course, this comes from many reasons. You are friends with the people you interact with every day. If you travel around, you might have friends in other cities, or if your friends move, then you will be stretching out these links, and I'll discuss this in a lot more detail in a second. So, and of course, you see these little peaks that correspond more or less to distances between continents and countries, etc. Right? So we're talking about Twitter and geolocated data, but you're not limited to actually looking just at the location field, right? Now, everybody has one of these things in their pocket, and Twitter is very nice, so whenever you try to tweet from your smartphone, Twitter will kindly ask you, would you like to add your location to that? Right? So you press a little button, and there will be your location in there. Now, of course, not everybody actually has cell phones, so here what we're looking at is the number of smartphone users in Twitter per capita, basically, a function for different countries. Of course, most Western countries and most rich countries will have more smartphones, so there's a strong correlation with GDP and being more Western or not. The highest ranking one, interestingly, is Kuwait, because they're small but very rich. And when you put all of these things together, the UK is sitting over there in position 4 or 5, 4. And of course, when you grab all of this data for a long period of time and you put all of these little dots on a map, you get something you recognize, right? So you see immediately the major cities, you see even major roads and railroad lines. So what this is showing us is that, yes, just using this and this, and you can, I mean, people argue a lot that Twitter is just a way for people to goof off and play with each other and talk and discuss things, but you can actually get a lot of information on where people are, what they're doing, what they're talking about, and how they're doing it and when, right? So you can get so I believe that you can actually get a very nice view of the real world through this lens of the virtual world somehow. So if you want to look at more shiny, pretty maps, you can go to this website, and actually will show you not only the geolocated information, but also disaggregated by language. So you can look at maps in different languages, etc. So you can see how many people are tweeting in Arabic in London, or in the UK in general. We don't go down to city level. Yes, so then you can zoom into the country and see the different, aggregated by the different languages. Yeah. So, but my point then is, okay, so you have this wealth of information. You have very, very, very precise GPS coordinates, right? You can actually zoom in and go down to the street level or the neighborhood level if you really want to, right? Something like that. And here I'm just showing you the different scales, so going from continent level all the way down to city or neighborhood level. So can you actually do something useful or and interesting with this instead of just making pretty maps and shiny animations? Right? So moving on, yes. So you can actually see and observe, so especially if we have Twitter data for an extended period of time. They've been accumulating these things for like 3 or 4 years at this point. You can actually track people over time and see how they are moving, right? So here we have a few simple maps of a few users just bouncing around over time in different countries, so in the US, in the UK, and in Germany. And here we have basically the connections between users embedded in space, right? So you have the follower and the followee links, but now where the nodes are laid out in physical space, so you can see basically what we're saying. Now you have many links that are very short. You have a few links that are very long, and this seems to be more or less the case between the US, the UK, Germany, etc. So if you're trying to characterize these things, can we actually define some type of geo social properties, right? So somehow looking at the social connections and by adding this geographical component and try to get this. So here what we're plotting is the link probability as a function of distance. So this is more or less the equivalent of that little peaky plot I showed you in the beginning. the disparity of the triangles, which is this fancy thing that basically tells you if the triangle looks something like this or if it looks like this, so how stretched out the triangle is. Link reciprocity, so what is the probability that I follow you and you follow me? And this, of course, is only for Twitter, while everything else has the 2 other data sets, so it's Twitter, Brightkite, and Gowawa. And here we have the clustering as a function of the distance, so how likely are you to have a triangle as a function of the distance? Right? So these are, would you think there are interesting properties that combine both the socio component and the geographical component? And of course, can we actually build some simple model that somehow explains this, or at least reproduces this in some way? And the answer, of course, is yes. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. So, and this simple model is very, very simple, right? So it's very data-driven. So we start with the population distribution, so we know how many people live more or less in each little square box. We know people moving around, so we know how much people are moving around based on the data directly. And then, of course, you can just create random connections. So you're starting, if you have one user, this little red dot over there, in the given position. At each time step, he's going to flip a coin, and he's going to decide, I am going to a completely new location, or I am going to visit a friend. So I'm going to a location I've been to before, right? So I'll come to Warwick, or I'll go somewhere new. And then you go there, right? So you actually change your position. And then you look around, and you meet people, right? So inside this little box, you look around, and you interact with people, right? And then you decide at some point for each of these people if you're going to be friends with them or not. So this is a very simple model. I mean, I'm hiding a lot of details in the data and how you analyze the data, but the idea is very simple. You have some probability of traveling to new places. You have some probability of making new friends. Right? And since you're embedding this in space, this, of course, the way you travel and the way you make friends will, of course, be reproduced, somehow influence these distributions you're going to get. So you have to find what are the values of these probabilities. So you just scan through phase space, and you find where is the minimum of this thing. And, of course, you'll find slightly different values for different countries because countries are a little bit different. But then when you actually compare the results between your model, so here I have, so the red line dots are Twitter data, the black lines is the model, and you can actually see a very good agreement, right? Both, sometimes even both quantitatively and qualitatively, in some cases just qualitatively. But you see that with just a simple model, with just 2 parameters, you can actually get very good agreement on 4 quantities, and actually looked at a couple of others, and those will also work reasonably well. Right? So it says that, okay, so now we have this data, we actually have some understanding of what the mechanisms are behind them and how that explains somehow the social geographical connections. Right? But I mentioned briefly before also this idea of language. You know? So you can see where people are, you can see how they're making friends and how they're talking to their friends. But it will be very interesting also to see what language they are using, right? Which language they are using. So if you use Chrome, you've seen something like this. So you go to a strange page. Here is the Qatari Google version. And Google looks at it and says, oh, this thing is written in Arabic, and this person doesn't speak Arabic. So maybe I should ask them if they want to translate it. So if you press a button, that magically becomes English, even though you're still in the same page. And here I just use the Google page because that's the easiest non-English web page I could come up with. But you can, of course, do this with any web page. But inside this little gray bar, in there is hiding a lot of technology. Technology that looks at the piece of text, determines what language it is, and then you have another piece of code that figures out how to translate from one language to another, etc. Right? And of course, it would be really useful if you could actually use that. Fortunately, Google has created an open source version of Chrome called Chromium. And somebody went to all the trouble of digging through the code of Chromium and actually extracting this little piece of technology and make a nice little library that you can download and use yourself. Right? So when you grab all this big data set of geolocated tweets, you run it through this little library that tells you what the language is. What you get is something like this. You get a map with shiny colors, right? And each color represents a language. And if you look at here, you will discover with great surprise that people speak English in England, Portuguese in Portugal, Spanish in Spain, French in France, and Italian in Italy, right? Which is not very surprising, if you really think about it. The surprising part is that it actually works, right? You're actually getting all of this data very easily. You're running it through this relatively simple code, and you're actually getting something that makes sense. Right? And for me, this is amazing. So this is the really cool part. But now you can start doing things that you couldn't. even have thought of doing a couple of years ago, right? So you can start looking, okay, so this is Twitter, so people might be biased towards English, so let's look what is the fraction of users that actually uses their primary language. So what this means is, so in Portuguese, in Portugal, how many people actually tweet in Portuguese? So here so that's the fraction we're plotting. So of course, English and Spanish-speaking countries tend to be mostly English and Spanish tweeting. Other countries vary a lot, of course. In China, nobody tweets in Chinese. Portugal, almost nobody tweets in Portuguese. In France, a little bit more, etc. Right? So you can see that there are variations, and you need to be careful. Because some things might work very well for some countries and not other countries, so you have to pay a little bit of attention to this. You can look, of course, at what is the distribution of languages. So, and this also gives you an intuition somehow on what are the communities that are present in that country. Right? If you have a big Arab-speaking community in a country, you'll probably see a lot of tweets in Arabic, which makes sense. So, and of course, UK is over there because these countries are ranked by fraction of English, and in the UK, people only speak English. They don't speak anything else practically, at least not when it comes to Twitter. You can, of course, use this also to establish very precise linguistic boundaries. So here we're plotting Belgium and Catalonia. So, and you can see very clearly the distinction of where people who speak French live, where people who speak Flemish live, or where people who speak Catalan and where people who speak Spanish live. So you can actually observe these in real space, but also in real time in a way, right? If you do this, if you update this map every day, you can actually observe how these things will be changing and varying. So what I'm doing here is I grabbed a map of Italy, I divided it into tiny, tiny little cells, and I put a little bar on each cell, right? What this bar tells me is how many tweets not in Italian are being produced in that little cell in that month. And what you're seeing here basically is the fluctuations of tourism, is people from outside Italy going to Rome and the beach in the summer. Why would anybody want to go to Rome in the summer is beyond me, and going to the mountains in the winter to ski, right? So you can actually observe touristic flows and people moving around, which is it's pretty cool. And since you can actually track these people, you can actually see where they came from, and you can observe actually how tourism is helping different countries interact with each other, which I think is very interesting. You can also look at how people are paying attention to something, right? So here, on May 2nd, you probably not recognize the date, but this was in 2010, I believe, was basically when Obama went in front of the cameras and said, "We killed Osama bin Laden." So that was that point over there. And this is people talking about Osama bin Laden. And of course, you have this huge spike of interest right in the beginning when the news hits. You can see where people are actually paying attention, where they are discussing it. Of course, you'll see a lot more interest in this in Western countries and in the US. You'll see also a lot of it in Middle Eastern countries because it's something that affects them directly, but you can observe people paying attention to different things, right, in real time again. So I will go through this very, very, very quickly. So this is an example that's slightly less serious. So this is American Idol, which is like the American version of Britain Got Talent, I guess. You can look at when people are discussing the contestants, so you can actually match the peaks of people talking about them to when they're actually in front of the camera. So you can actually see what people are watching on TV, which is kind of fascinating. You can see where, since you have geolocation, you can actually see where each contestant is more popular, right? So this is for 3 different weeks. So when there were 5 contestants, 4 contestants, and 3 contestants left. So you can see where each contestant is more popular. And you can think of this more or less as a very, very simple proxy for elections, right? For people voting for something. So if you say this, okay, if I assume that this is an election and people tweeting about something is people voting for someone, can we actually make a prediction of what is the outcome of this election, right? So we actually did this. We posted it to the archive a few hours before the final, saying who the winner is going to be, right? And basically you have 2 very interesting plots in there, which are this one. So this one is, if you look at the entire number of tweets for the entire world, what you will see is that Jessica will win because she has a lot more tweets. While if you look at the tweets just coming from the US, you will see that Philip will win, right? And indeed what happens is that he wins. And the reason he wins is this. She is very, very popular in the Philippines because her family is from the Philippines. So people in the Philippines were very excited that she was in the final and they were talking about her a lot. While he's very popular in the US, and he won because only people in the US could vote, right? So what this means is also, I'd like to finish with this example because it's always a little caveat. Okay, you have the data, you can analyze it, you can make all sorts of pretty maps and pretty plots, but you have to be careful and make sure that you know what you're analyzing and what you're saying. You need to make sure that the population you're looking at is the population you're interested in, et cetera, right? But based just on the data, you can actually make predictions in advance. And I said I really flew through this. There's a lot more details that you can get on that paper. I won't go into it, but the idea is that even in this very simplified case, you can actually make a prediction ahead of time and be right, which is kind of cool. So just to finish, we can get all sorts of interesting data. You can look at them in very interesting ways and observe and get a new perspective on human behavior, observe it how it's changing in time and space. You can see how languages are being used and how they're interacting with each other. And there's a lot, and if you found this interesting, I have a lot of more of this stuff coming down the pipeline that I can't really talk about right now because it's not out yet. So, but hopefully it will be out soon. So if you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruno. This was very interesting. We have time for a short question, if there is a question.
What fraction of all the tweets are geotagged?
Less than 5%.
Sorry?
Less than 5%.
So then it also contributes to the last point you made, I guess. Like, it's not a very good representative sample of even all the Twitter users, which is still not a good representative sample of all the population.
Yes, you have to be careful on how you look at things. I mean, these things are biased by definition. In the case of the American Idol, for example, we kind of cheated a little bit. We used American Idol because we knew more or less that the demographics of American Idol and the demographics of Twitter were similar. So we wouldn't be too far off in terms of demographics. But you have to be careful on how you weigh things and how you look at things. So there's a lot of caveats that go into all of this that I couldn't, of course, go into in detail. But yes. But if you're careful and if you look at things properly, you can do things. But you have to be careful. So that's